give the people time. Give people what they want. Well. Don't you know you got to give the people what they want.
Hello, I'm Connor Henderson, Assistant Professor of Marketing at the University of Oregon. This presentation is for my marketing strategy students. Today I'm talking about how to use marketing engineering to conduct a conjoint analysis. Conjoint analysis is one of the most popular marketing research tools in modern consulting. What's great is that with marketing engineering, you can learn how to conduct your own conjoint analysis, and although it's not the most state-of-the-art, it's fairly effective at helping you do a better job in new product design. So why is conjoint analysis so popular? When designing a new product, the product is comprised as a whole of many different parts, and there's trade-offs inherent in putting together these parts into the whole. For instance, when designing a new truck, if you want to increase towing capacity, there's probably going to be implications for the fuel efficiency of the truck. When you consider all the different parts and options that go into making a truck, the total number of possible trucks that you could create and design, it's almost infinite. Conjoint analysis is so powerful because it informs us how customers value each different option that we want them to consider, and it gathers this information in a smart way. We get customers to evaluate trucks as a whole, and from those evaluations, we can infer how they value each part that goes into a truck. From our understanding of their individual values of each component of the truck, we can run simulations that predict which truck will perform the best on the marketplace in terms of capturing market share, generating revenue, and if you want to include the cost of each option you're considering in the truck, you can run a simulation that predicts the profit margin. Conjoint analysis is very complex. The best way for me to demonstrate how to use it is just to immediately jump into an example. So, right now, it's lunchtime. I'm hungry. I'm thinking about pizza. Let's say you're in charge of designing a frozen pizza. The question is, how should you make the pizza? Do you want to make a SpongeBob pizza? A Santa Claus pizza? There's thousands and thousands and thousands of different frozen pizzas that you could create. And how do you decide which one to create? Well, it'd be great to understand what the customer wants, so you can give them what they want. In Conjoint, we can answer that question. What does a customer want in a frozen pizza? Now, how do we do that? First, we think of a pizza as comprised of a set of different attributes. Picking the attributes is difficult, and I'm not going to tell you how to do that in this presentation. Just know that if you have the right attributes, the relevant attributes, the attributes your customers care about, your simulations predicting how a new product will do will be more accurate. So in this case, I'm going to say that a pizza is comprised of 5 different attributes: the crust, the toppings, the cheese, the amount of cheese, and the price. These are 5 attributes that together describe a pizza. Now for Connor's new awesome frozen pizza, I'm considering different options within each attribute. For the crust, I can either do a pan crust pizza, a thin crust pizza, or a thick crust pizza. I don't know which one to do. It can be one of those 3. I'm going to let my customers try to inform me. For the topping, I'm considering 4 different options: pineapple, veggie, sausage, and pepperoni. A note of caution: for Conjoint, you can understand how customers evaluate and prefer what you put into the study. But don't limit yourself in terms of thinking about new products to introduce to only what you considered in your study. While in this example, customers only see one of the 4 options present on a pizza, in the real world, you have to consider, are these mutually exclusive, or could I be creative? Potentially, there's some other toppings I'm also excluding. While Conjoint is very good and very effective at understanding how customers prefer what you ask them about and what you put into the Conjoint study design, it limits you to only have a few options considered for each attribute. That's one of the downsides of Conjoint. For cheese, I'm considering a Romano cheese, mixed cheese, and a mozzarella cheese. For the attribute amount of cheese, there's two different options, either a 2-ounce option or a 6-ounce. Should I consider other options, potentially a 4-ounce option or an 8-ounce option, maybe even a 10-ounce option? That's hard to say. Understanding what's relevant to include in your study design can be informed by a few things. In considering which levels to include in my study for an attribute, such as amount of cheese, I want to consider what competitors are doing. If I can describe competitors' pizza with the levels I've included, let's say all competitors do either 2 ounces or 6 ounces, then my simulations predicting how I can impact market share and revenue with a new pizza will be more accurate. Also, I want to take into account what I can do. And the truck example, it's not really relevant to include 60 miles per gallon as one of the levels if I'm looking at fuel efficiency as an attribute, if it's impossible to create a truck that does 60 miles per gallon, especially if none of my competitors do it either. The third factor you need to consider when deciding what levels to include in a conjoint study is what do customers want. Now I know the point of the conjoint is to find out what customers want, but at least you should do some qualitative research ahead of time to consider what options do conversations with customers through focus groups that describe the amount of cheese that they think is relevant to a pizza. For price, you see I have 3 levels, $9.99, $8.99, $7.99. Price is a great thing to include in any conjoint analysis. The reason being is it has direct implications for revenue. It also can help in your simulation as you consider how it fits into the competitive landscape. Now, one thing to note, when you're finished with your conjoint, you'll understand how customers prefer these different price options, these different levels of price. But again, you'll only get an insight onto the levels that are included in your study. So what if customers, for instance, actually would really want a $16 pizza? Maybe a $16 pizza would stand out on the marketplace and imply that it was especially tasty. Well, you would never know that that would actually be a preferred option if it wasn't included in your study design. There's actually a real-world example of this. I believe it was Xerox. They created a new machine, business to business, to scan and organize documents. They knew how much it was going to cost them to produce, but they didn't know what to price it at. So they used a conjoint study and they had the new machine evaluated at different price points. Well, they chose a few price points they felt were reasonable. They also decided to choose a few price points that were very, very high. It turned out when customers evaluated this new product as a whole, they gave a higher rating when there was a high price point attached to it. So Xerox actually went to market at the higher price point. They made twice as much on their margin, and adoption was actually a lot stronger. This was in the business-to-business setting. They were selling to hospitals and financial firms where they were more concerned about getting a product that worked well and provided the value that it promised than they were concerned about the actual price of paying for it. Certainly for things like wine, there's an implied understanding that the more it costs, the better it must be. So you have to be very careful when selecting what levels to include for each attribute. For more advanced conjoint study designs, there's something called an adaptive conjoint. It'll have customers evaluate different options over time, and it will change each option presented, almost like a GMAT test that's online, where you get harder and harder questions the more you answer correctly to try to zero in on how smart you are. An adaptive conjoint tries to zero in on your ideal point by changing the prices and narrowing in on what you like the most. But in the marketing engineering world and also in the MarkStrat world, we just come up with a few different options to have evaluated up front, and then from that we get ratings on how customers prefer those options. If you have a narrow set of options that are being evaluated, if you're in the right range, if you're in the ballpark, you can get a pretty precise and accurate indicator of what the ideal level is that customers prefer the most. But if you're too narrow, as in this case, just a $7 to $9 range, perhaps you could miss that maybe $5 is most preferred, or a $12 pizza is most preferred. So a narrow range can help you be precise, but only if the range covers the true ideal point. Anyways, if you consider all these different attributes, these 5 different attributes that I can use to describe this frozen pizza, and the different options or levels within each attribute, a total of 216 different pizzas could be developed from all the different combinations. Now the issue is, which pizzas should I develop? Which pizza should I introduce? Sure, it doesn't take a lot of engineering and science to make a pizza, but if it's a frozen pizza and I'm going to roll it out across supermarkets all across the country, put some advertising money behind it, I don't want to launch a pizza that's not the perfect one. So what should I do? Well, I could do a survey and just ask a bunch of customers to indicate what they prefer the most, give a rating of how much they like pan crust, thin crust, thick crust. I could have them rate all the different toppings, all the different cheeses, and even the price. But what actually we've discovered, researchers who study conjoint analysis, if you have customers rate the whole entire pizza, it's actually more predictive of future choices than if you have them rate each single attribute and each option within each attribute one at a time. So what we want to do is we want to have some of these 216 options get rated by customers. We want them to rate it from maybe a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is I really don't like that pizza, and 100 is that pizza sounds delicious, or I would love that pizza. But it's impossible to get anyone to rate 216 pizzas, right? What marketing engineering will do, it will tell us of these 216 possible pizzas, which ones should we get ratings on? And from those ratings, because each pizza will be a little bit different, we can compare those ratings, almost like an experiment, and say, hey, this type of pizza, which has a pan crust, and also pineapple, and also Romano, does a little bit better than the thin crust pizza that also has pineapple and Romano. And by comparing the ratings across these different pizzas that are rated as a whole, we can understand how customers value and prefer each different option. And we also can see across the attributes which ones are the most important. Is price what mainly determines the ratings, or is it amount of cheese? While 6 ounces may be preferred to 2 ounces, it's important to know how that preference relates to things like price, because 6 ounces might be more expensive to produce. Well, price customers are very sensitive and they want to pay the least amount of money. And the strength of how they care about price is much stronger than the strength about how they care about cheese. And for us as the manufacturer, we have a trade-off. If we do more cheese, it's more expensive, that's going to hurt our margin. If we do lower price, that's also going to hurt our margin. So we have to look at these trade-offs and try to understand, well, customers want low price and a lot of cheese, which one's more important to them? And the conjoint can take into account that trade-off and say, hey, you better focus on price. If you have to ignore cheese and go with the lower ounces, that's okay. Customers will still buy it. You want to take into account both those issues, because if you just try to make the perfect pizza, it might not be economically feasible. And in the case of designing a truck, if you want a large towing capacity, but also have it be very fuel efficient, technically, that might not even be possible. Alright, so I want to go over to Excel and show you how I would do a conjoint study if I wanted to get ratings of all these different options, and from that design the perfect pizza. You know, there's 216 pizzas that I could make, but I need to figure out which one I should make. Okay, here we are in Excel. And we're going to start by going to the add-in for marketing engineering for Excel and finding our conjoint option. Now, it's very helpful to print out the PDF for conjoint. It's also helpful just to read about conjoint on Wikipedia and get a sense for what it is and how it's done. But you don't want to get confused by all the different versions of conjoint. Philosophically, it's the same thing. We want to understand what an individual customer values in terms of the options that could go into designing a new product or a new service offering. but the technical ways of collecting ratings of customers can change. The most advanced is choice-based conjoint and an adaptive conjoint to get the ratings of different options. In our case, we're going to do a very simple marketing engineering version, but it's still very effective for understanding what customers prefer and then doing a simulation to understand how a new product would perform. Of course, all the simulations are based on the assumptions that underlie them. So the first thing we're going to do to understand which pizza we should launch is to create the study design template. The interactive assistant is helpful. We'll use it. So it wants to know what attributes are we going to consider in our pizza or whatever you're going to study. We're studying pizzas, and the attributes I decided to study are crust, topping, cheese, amount of cheese. For amount of cheese, I could force preference ordering. Now this option would say that every customer, I believe, thinks that more cheese the better, and I could do increasing. It's not important to do this. You can still get ratings without it. Potentially it can make it so that you can have customers rate less pizzas and still get accurate responses. But it relies on the assumption that all customers prefer more cheese. And since I don't know I like that assumption, I'm not going to include it. And then the last attribute I'm going to consider is price. I also like to include brand sometimes to understand the impact of a brand. And you'll see that what you do is you present different pizzas to be evaluated. And sometimes it's interesting to see how evaluations change as the price changes or the brand changes. In this case, we're not going to focus on brand, but price is something we want to understand how it impacts customers' preference for pizzas. Oh, and for price, I could have also made it so that I force it to assume that customers prefer a lower price. But for fine wines, for example, sometimes people think the more it costs, the better it is. If we were going to have customers do a taste test of the pizza, we might expect that if we had a higher price tag attached to it, they would think it tasted better, and they might provide a higher overall rating. Maybe they think the ingredients are better if it costs more. So I don't like the assumption of putting an order restriction on it. The next step in the design is to specify which levels or which options we want evaluated for each attribute. So for crust, what levels should I consider? Well, I decide I can do a pan crust pizza, a thin crust pizza, or a thick crust pizza. Again, choosing which levels is very important. You want to base it on what your competitors are doing so you can describe their offerings. That helps for the simulations. You want to focus on what you can do. There's no point in considering an option that both you can't do and your competitors can't do. And then you also want to think about what customers prefer. So I'm going to go ahead and enter these for all the attributes. I won't have you watch me do it all, but you would do the same thing if you design your study design template. Okay, so I just entered in all the levels for price, and that's the last attribute that I'm having as part of my evaluation. When I'm done, click Next. It gives me this option to do the data collection template. Would I like to do it now or later? You might as well hit now. And so what you need to decide is, how are you going to get ratings of these options? You can either do self-explicated or you can do the ratings option. The ratings option is where you have customers evaluate a pizza as a whole, or these whole products that have the attributes describing the product altogether, and then you have them rate that whole pizza. And that actually is better able to predict choices in the real world. And ratings of each individual part are more accurate when you use this rating of the whole pizza, versus the other option is self-explicated. And that's where you have customers say, well, I think crust is more important than toppings, and toppings is more important than cheese, but amount of cheese is my second most preferred thing, and overall I care about price. So first you say how you care about the different attributes, and then within each attribute you rank the options that are being considered. Maybe you say thin is my most preferred, pan is my second most preferred, and thick is my least preferred. That's an okay way of going about data collection. It's better than not doing the study at all. but the ratings is better at actually predicting choices in the real world. So we'll go with that option. We don't have a column for preference ordering, which would say everybody prefers a lower priced pizza to a high priced pizza. So we don't click this button. You want to enter in the number of respondents. If you don't know how many respondents you'll be able to get data from, you can either just make this a really high number, or you can wait till you collect the data and then redo this step and enter in a higher number or a lower number, depending on how many people you actually get to respond to your conjoint study. Okay, so in this case, I'll just do 4. For your homework, the first time you do it, you're going to do 1, and you're going to do your own ratings. So what it needs to know are what are the different attributes that are going to be used to describe my product, and what are the levels or the options that are considered within each attribute. And it automatically knows where it is, so it's selected the appropriate cells, and you click OK. Okay, and what you get is a new Excel workbook, and in this workbook you see the study design template at the top, which you already created, and then there's this list of bundles, and these bundles basically are a collection of attributes with a different level for each attribute. So here are the attributes: crust, toppings, cheese, amount of cheese, and price, the ones I said were going to be a part of my study. And for each bundle, there's a slightly different version of levels that are used to describe the bundle. So bundle 1 is described as a pan crust pizza with pineapple toppings, Romano cheese, 2 ounces of Romano cheese, and it costs $7.99. And what's so neat about this is that marketing engineering says these are the bundles I need you to get ratings on. So if you can get 4 people to rate each of these bundles, I can tell you for each of those 4 people how they prefer each option within the bundle. How do you know, of the 216 possible pizzas that could come from combining all the different options you're considering, which ones to have evaluated? Well, marketing engineering says if you can get these bundles to be evaluated, and there's actually 16 of them, you can see that. With these 16, they're all slightly different in a very smart way, that if we got ratings on all of them, we'd be able to infer how customers prefer each particular option. So that's what we need to do. And it's not extremely precise because there's lots of difficulties in collecting conjoint data. One is, are you just going to describe pizzas to people and ask them to give you a rating? Are you just going to say, pretend you're about to eat a pizza that's pan crust, pineapple, Romano cheese, 2 ounces of it, and $7.99. Well, that description and having customers imagine it might work okay because they've all had pizzas before. They understand what these attributes and levels are. They're familiar with the category, but it's not real. They're not actually in the store making a decision. They don't see the box. They don't see what it would look like. They can't smell it. They can't taste it. And so if you really are going to use these conjoint results to make an important decision for your business, you may consider hiring a consultant that specializes in collecting conjoint ratings. And what they would do is potentially create pictures and mock-ups and drawings, maybe advertisements, commercials that would be viewed. And so for each bundle, they might even, in this case, create a pizza that they'd have people taste. Or they would put it in a refrigerator like you would at the store in a frozen pizza. And they'd have people walk by and they would see all 16 options and they would choose different ones. And you could see how it performed in a little mock-up store. So there's very expensive ways to collect the ratings, and there's also kind of the most simplest, just describe a pizza to someone and ask them to give a rating. But what you want is respondents to rate each bundle on a scale of 0 to 100. 100, they think that would be a great pizza, they'd really want it. And 0 would be no way, I don't want to buy that pizza. So if you get these ratings, what we'll be able to do is find out how much pan crust is valued, thin crust is valued, thick crust is valued. We can understand how each customer values all these different options. Now what's important is that we need to understand which bundles to have evaluated in a way that we can infer from the ratings how each component is valued. Okay? So I went out and I collected ratings of ideal customers who I think are very important. Let's say I couldn't survey the whole market, but I found 4 different people who are trendsetters. If they like something, the rest of America falls in line. I have ratings of myself, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and Miles Davis. It might be impossible to get a dead person to rate your pizza, but it's not impossible for me. And before I talk about these ratings and how I use them, I want to just say a few things about this study design. What you notice here is that for topping, I have 4 different levels, but for amount of cheese, I only have 2 different levels being considered. And that's actually a problem. If you do a conjoint study and you read about conjoints, there's lots of different reasons why sometimes the ratings don't reflect actual purchases very accurately. And it's important to be aware of those. It's very easy to find that out. If you just read the Wikipedia page on conjoint analysis, it'll tell you some of the problems. And the consultants have tried to develop a solution to each problem. But for instance, you'll notice for every single bundle, it's either 2 ounces or 6 ounces. It doesn't change that often. And so either the pizza is described as having a lot of cheese or a little bit of cheese. And because it doesn't change that often, people stop paying attention to it when they have to rate a bunch of different pizzas or a bunch of different bundles. So ideally, we can use the fewest amount of bundles necessary to get accurate understanding of customers' preferences for each option. The more levels we include for an attribute, such as in this case we have 4 for toppings, the more bundles it takes to find out customers' preferences. So in this case I might think, am I really going to design a pineapple pizza? Let's say I don't think I will. Maybe I'm far away from Hawaii and I can't source pineapples. It might be worthwhile to not include pineapple and redo my study. And that way I'll only have 1 blank. And basically the more blanks you have, the more times customers have to see that same option presented over and over again. And that actually can lead to fatigue. And also if you have too many bundles and too many different changes, people might gloss over those changes. Another issue is oftentimes respondents focus more on things that are more emotional, and rather the concrete things like price or amount of cheese can get lost, especially if it's in a description and not a picture or in a store environment. And it's just very complex to get someone to give you an accurate rating of 16 different bundles. And so that's where the adaptive conjoint or the choice-based conjoint, where they say, hey, here's 2 different pizzas, a pan crust pineapple Romano 2 ounces $7.99, or a thin pineapple mixed cheese 6 ounces $9.99. Choose one, and then the respondent just picks A or B, and then they keep giving them different options, different A, B. They pit one pizza versus another against each other, and as you see customers choose which ones they prefer, and the options keep changing and changing to narrow in on the ideal point, you get a better accurate sense of how preferences underlie these choices. Anyways, that's more just talking about how to do a conjoint in the ideal case. It's not so relevant to your homework, but I want you to be aware of it so that you can answer the questions in your homework about what are some of the problems and pros and cons of doing a conjoint. It's a good idea to read a little bit about that on your own. I'm not going to try to bore you in this presentation by going through all of the things that lead to fatigue or how it's difficult to express your attitudes to new innovative products. In this case, we got pizzas, and Connor, he knows exactly what he wants to eat. Does he like a pan pineapple Romano pizza? No way. He gave it a 0. Miles Davis also doesn't like it. But hey, Jimi Hendrix does like it. So what we might end up finding out is, hey, there could be a few different segments within these customers. Or you want to just focus in on surveying your target segment. If you've already done a segmentation and you know who you want to go after, you can just say, let's do a conjoint on the segment we want to go after and find out what pizza it likes to eat. In this case, it looks like we've surveyed very different people because the ratings are very, very different. The pan sausage mozzarella 6 ounces for $9.99. That was Connor's first choice. Gave 100 points to it. I'm sorry for talking in the third person. It's just that I see my own name, so. Anyways, You're going to put your name down in your homework assignment, and you're going to rate the bundles that are presented to you. And what'll be cool is you'll be able to see how your ratings of the bundles end up predicting your preferences for the underlying attributes that go into creating the bundles. And that's what we do in this next step. So we go back to the add-ins for marketing engineering, and what we want to do is estimate the part worth. Now, preference part worth, what does that mean? It means that we know that pizzas are comprised of parts, and we want to understand what, for each customers, how they prefer each part, how much each part is worth to them. So what we're going to do is tell them how we collected our data. In this case, we used the ratings. That's what you'll do for your homework assignment. It's more predictive of choice, so that's why we like it. It's better. It's good to check that it's selected the right data. So first it wants to know what the attributes and levels are, and then it wants to know what bundles were evaluated, and finally it wants to know what ratings were done. And I'll have to show you that. So we select those ratings of each bundle. So for bundle, we're just talking about these are the hypothetical products we had evaluated. We call it a bundle because it bundles together all the different attributes and describes something as a whole. And when we hit run, what we get is this preference part worth, and it tells us what each respondent or customer, what they prefer. So how do we interpret this? It's just like your MarkStrat conjoint. So let me show you that. So in MarkStrat, you can order a conjoint study, and this is focusing on a particular target segment, the professionals. And we get to see that there was 4 attributes that were considered in the study. So they described the product in terms of 4 attributes: its price, the processing power, the display size, and the design index. And these are the part worths. It tells you all the levels that were evaluated and how much each level is preferred, how much each level is important to the customers in terms of their rating of the overall product. And what we see is in terms of the professional segment, what they cared most for, the thing that made them really like a potential product, was if it had a price tag of $389. That meant that if it had that price tag attached to it, the professionals gave it a pretty high rating. The worst thing to do was say it only cost $310. At that point, the professionals probably thought it's junk, it's going to have problems, and they're making some negative inferences about what a low-priced product would have. What we don't know is $389 their ideal point, or is it just the best of the 4 prices that were considered in the study? And that's where it's just hard to know, before you run your study if you're using the right levels. In the adaptive conjoint, it can keep changing and changing the products that are described, so the ratings can be more accurate and kind of narrow in on the ideal price. But in marketing engineering, it just says if you have 4 levels evaluated, of those 4, which ones is most important. So the most important thing you want to do is get your price right. You can have a big difference in how customers evaluate it if it's priced somewhere around $389 versus way too high or way too low, right? You got to be Goldilocks. Be just right. For processing power, it's also important to get it right. And we see big differences in how each part is valued. A processing power of 84, that's liked a lot. The professionals love it. But if you're up way high around 100 or way low around 52, they're not very happy. They don't rate those products very highly when they have either too much processing power or too little. In terms of display size, customers seem to like products pretty much whatever the display size was. 22 was a little bit worse than 40, but don't spend a lot of time getting the perfect display size for the professionals if it's going to cause you to produce it at a higher price, because it doesn't hurt you that much in terms of their ratings if you use a low display size or a high display size. So that's the power of conjoint, really, is that you're not just understanding what the ideal point is, but you're comparing the ideal point for one attribute versus the ideal point for another attribute, and you can understand how to take into consideration trade-offs. Because as the customers rate each bundle, they're also taking into consideration the trade-offs. They say, hey, maybe I'd prefer 34 as my display size, but my ratings are going to reflect what I care about most, and that's processing power and price. And also for design index, we see this pattern where as long as it's good enough, as long as it's 8 or above, customers were pretty happy and they focused on whether or not the processing power was good and the price was good. If it was a 7, they might give their product a lower rating, the bundle a lower rating. And so as customers are forced to view these at once as a whole product, you can see how the different dimensions evaluated, the different options evaluated, impact their ratings. By getting display size correct, it didn't really impact whether or not they gave a high rating or a low rating, because while customers may prefer a certain display size, they weren't that sensitive to it compared to the other attributes that were being considered. So these are the part worths. This shows for a certain segment what each part is worth to them in determining their ratings, and hopefully those ratings correlate to purchases. So back to our Excel, we see that each attribute has its options displayed together. So these are the different crusts: pan, thin, and thick. I can do something like take an average for all respondents, and I would simply do an equals average and find out that on average, pan crust got a rating of 4.75. And we want to look at ratings on other attributes and levels, other options, to see if that's relatively high or low. Overall, it seemed like in this case, people didn't really care what type of crust was used. While thick crust might have been the most popular, overall, it was just narrowly the most popular. And we also see differences between the respondents. Jimi Hendrix seemed to put some importance on having either pan or thin crust as opposed to the thick crust pizza. Where some of the other respondents, you see the difference between their highest rated option and their lowest rated option was quite small. Bob Dylan, looks like he might prefer thick, but not by a whole lot. And same with me. I liked thick. It indicates I like thick, but not by a whole lot. And what might happen in this case is you could see small little differences, between your most preferred being a 0 and between your least preferred being a 0 and your most preferred being a 5. That could just be a happy accident. Maybe because every time you saw pineapple, if you didn't like pineapple at all, as is my case, you gave that pizza rating a really low score. And because it's just this one thing that no matter what you're going to give a low rating to, it'll impact all the other attribute levels that happen to be grouped in with that option. And so if crust wasn't perfectly done so that each crust was paired with pineapple at least once, then it might not truly capture my preferences for crust. So what happens is you see the preferences for your kind of most important attributes should reflect reality more so than your preferences for some of your other attributes where you don't see big differences. And in this case, for topping, it seemed to be very important in that my least preferred option is very, 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 very much lower than my most preferred option. But in this case, what's driving this isn't so much that I really like veggie, sausage, or pepperoni, but more so it seems to be that I just hate pineapple. For Jimi Hendrix, he seems to like two options, pineapple or veggie, but he doesn't like sausage or pepperoni. So how might this be created by the data? Maybe Jimi Hendrix is a vegetarian. The 16 bundles, or the 16 different options that I had people evaluate, well, it does a good job of mixing and matching the options in a smart way that we can try to infer the ideal option. It tries to also do it with having the least amount of bundles evaluated. So only 16 pizzas were evaluated out of a total of 216 possible pizzas. And with that, you're not going to get it to perfectly represent your preferences. It'll just be in general. It'll capture kind of the trend. And hopefully you'll see that in your homework and you can lend some insight into why it did a good job of capturing your preferences or maybe why it didn't. And maybe something surprised you. So in having customers rate fewer possible pizzas, you also sacrifice a little bit of accuracy. What MarkStrat does is tell you the best kind of combination between having the least amount evaluated and getting the best way of trying to capture preferences. And we also see the ratings for things like type of cheese. We see ratings for ounces of cheese. It seemed like in this case everybody prefers more cheese to less cheese, although there's differences in how important that is. Where Bob Dylan really liked having a lot of cheese, and Miles Davis and Jimi Hendrix, it almost didn't matter at all. Or probably didn't matter at all. Also, for price, in this case it's kind of funny. You see that everybody actually didn't mind paying a higher price. Now why is that? Perhaps because I entered the data and I didn't actually survey any of these people, or perhaps because we like high-priced pizzas more than low-priced pizzas because we are, snobby, all right? We don't like money. We like our pizza people to make a lot of money. Okay, so those are the ratings. And what's interesting is if you remember the segmentation, we want to know how much customers value each kind of thing that goes into an offering. Well, if you have these different ratings, you could certainly segment it, right? Maybe there's 2 segments of customers. It's important to know whether or not this captures one target segment or whether or not it captures all the customers. And so we could go to marketing engineering and segmentation, and we could run a segmentation. If you do this for your homework, the only thing I'd say is just check. Just check to see if there's a segment or if there's multiple segments and talk about what the implications might be. In this case, I could, let's say, do 2 or 3 segments, but the problem is I only have 4 respondents, so it's probably not going to be very informative. And just looking at the 4 respondents, I can see that there's pretty big differences in what makes people like a pizza. Another thing you can do with these ratings is you can see what someone's ideal pizza would be. In my case, what you would want to do is find the highest rating for each option. So for the crust, we would find out that it was the thick crust. And maybe we would want to highlight it. And then for our topping, sausage was preferred, mozzarella cheese was preferred, 6 ounces, and $9.99. If I highlight all those, I'll see that I have a preferred pizza that is including all these different levels within each attribute. And if I add all of those up, they should equal 100. The reason why it always equals 100 is because the software normalizes it so that every respondent has their favorite pizza or favorite option equal 100. And that way, when we try to do any market share simulations, no one customer is more important than other customers. Okay, so now that you have the respondents' preference part works, you know how they prefer each level within each attribute, what their most preferred options are. You can either aggregate them up into an average and try to use that to determine which type of pizza to make, or you can run a simulation. And the simulation is great because it can predict how much market share you can capture, and it can also predict how much revenue, what the revenue implications will be, and also the profit margin. So you go to Conjoint and you go to Create Analysis Template. And you have to select the options of what you want to put into your simulation. So if you have information on the existing pizzas that are being sold on the marketplace, then you would click this box for existing product profiles. If you knew their market share, that's even better. The current market share is great. Put that information in, and what will happen is the simulations will take into account both the existing market share, the attributes of the existing products, and the preferences and the preference part worth to predict the new market share when you introduce a new product. You're going to want to say what new products you're considering. So you'll click that box. If you want to take into account revenue information, this says revenue, but it's actually more profit because you can do revenue or cost. You can say that perhaps price, if it costs more, you'll get more revenue out of it. And then also you could say something like cheese might be more expensive if you have 6 ounces versus 2 ounces. So it's not just how much money you'll make in terms of selling the product, but also how much it'll cost you to produce the product. So revenue is really the wrong word, but what's great is you can use this option to estimate how much profit you'll get from selling any pizzas. If you want to restrict attribute levels, that's basically to say that some current pizzas out there are selling pineapple, but I can't sell pineapple, so I'm not going to include that as an option. That can be useful. Let's say you have a pizza on the market that's pineapple, but there's no way you can get enough supply to produce another type of pineapple pizza. You want to use the pineapple information in estimating the market shares because it describes the current marketplace, but you're not going to have it included in any estimation of the optimal or ideal product to introduce. For respondents weights, that would mean you know that you've collected a bias sample. So obviously, if your sample that you had to rate your pizzas doesn't reflect the real marketplace, the real customers out there buying, you're not going to do a good job of predicting market share implications of introducing a new product. But if you know it's biased, let's say you know that half of pizza buyers are female, but 30% of your respondents were female, you would want to weight the females that are in your response set to be more important so that it corrects for that bias in your sample collection. In this case, I'm not going to worry about that. I also just check off that the first column contains respondents' IDs. Okay, so next I have to tell them what my attributes were in each level that went into it. I have to tell them my part worths. And then I have to describe what's currently offered on the market. And so I'll enter in the name of some of the current pizzas. So what are the other pizzas that are currently on the marketplace? Well, one is the Aloha Special. And what type of attributes does it have? It's a pan crust pizza. It has pineapple, as you might guess. The type of cheese is mozzarella. It has 6 ounces of that cheese. Once I've entered in the name and the information, I add it to my list. And I enter in all the other pizzas. There's 2 other pizzas. I'll enter them in on my own. So I entered the Aloha Special, the pepper pie that's got thick crust, pepperoni, mixed cheese, 6 ounces, $9.99, and the heart this. It's a thin crust veggie with Romano cheese, 2 ounces, $7.99. And those are the 3 frozen pizzas being sold on the marketplace. So I click next. And then it wants to know, hey, what new pizzas are you considering? And actually there's 2 pizzas I'm considering. There's the Italian sausage for $8.99. Add that to the list. And there's the Chicago Land Za. I'll add that to the list. Okay, so I'm either going to introduce one of those 2 pizzas, at least that's my plan. And what I see is that I have this nice spreadsheet set up to run some simulations. The first table just lists all the different attributes and levels that go into making a pizza that were considered in my conjoint study design. Level constraints, this tells me that for the market share optimal products, if I want it to be considered in introducing the optimal product, I should hit a 1. And if I don't want a value as an option, I should put a 0. So in this case, I want everything to be an option except for pineapple. I'm not going to do a pineapple pizza because I'm already selling the Aloha Special. Maybe I can't actually get enough pineapples to produce a second pineapple pizza. So I constraint that option. You won't need to do the constraints for your homework. It's just something I wanted to show you as part of the simulation options. For revenue potential, this is important for your homework. And so what you need to know is what the impact will be on, now they say revenue, but possibly negative, basically on the contribution margin of each unit that you sell. And so the first level they put as 0 as the reference base case. And then if another option is going to be able to generate more revenue, you would make it positive. Let's say you had to pay extra if you wanted more cheese. So for the 6-ounce cheese, maybe if I'm going to charge people more, an extra $1 a pizza, let's say, I would put a 1 there. Now that would work for the pizza shop where they order it, but it's not going to work for the frozen pizza. And actually in this case, it's going to cost me 3 times as much money. Let's say cheese is very expensive. I'll make that -3. For the crust, perhaps a thin crust is less expensive, and so I would get a higher contribution margin. And the thick crust, we'll say, is the same as the pan crust. Actually, I'll make it more expensive. Now in your homework assignment, it tells you the incremental impact on the contribution margin of each option. You need to make sure that this chart corresponds to the information in the homework. Now in filling in this chart, you should know that each box here corresponds to these levels up here. And so I can copy and paste it and put it next to it to help me remember what each level stands for. So the base case is going to be pan, pineapple, Romano, 2 ounces, $7.99. So I'm comparing everything to that base case. Okay, for the toppings, we'll say that veggie is a little bit more expensive than pineapple. We'll say sausage is more expensive. And pepperoni is the same. For cheese, mixed cheese is less expensive, so that positively impacts our contribution margin. But mozzarella is actually more expensive than Romano. And our price, of course, $8.99 will give us an extra $1 compared to $7.99. And $9.99 will give us $2 extra. So that's how each option impacts our contribution margin. The preference part worths stay the same. These are the existing product profiles, and I said I had market share information, so I need to enter that here. Let's say the Aloha Special had a market share of 30%. The Pepper Pie had an existing market share of 40%, and the Heart This had a market share of 30%. Once I have the existing market share information, I'll be better able to do a simulation that tells me how either the Italian sausage option I'm considering or the Chicagoland za option I'm considering will impact market share if it's introduced into the marketplace. I'll also be able to use the revenue potential information to give me an indication of which one will be most profitable. Of course, we typically think that the higher the market share, the better. But let's say you can sell something with a higher margin but get less market share. It could potentially be better than a lower margin offering that captures more market share. We'll take that into account in the simulation. Okay, so to run a simulation, once you have the spreadsheet set up, you go to Conjoint and you go to Run Analysis. If you just want to do a market share simulation, let's say you don't have existing market shares, you could do existing product profiles only. But we already know the market share, so we'll do with the new product profiles. These are the ones that we entered. We're considering the Chicagoland za or the Italian sausage. If I want to just let the software predict and just tell me what would be optimal, I could do this third option. And I could either optimize for market share or I could optimize using that revenue potential data. And ideally, if you have that data, you want to use the revenue data. You can consider 5 different options, Maybe some of them are going to impact your branding, or there's some strategic implications to not just focus on market share or revenue. And so you want to look at as many different options of the optimal product portfolios as possible to consider which one fits best with your brand position, your long-term strategy, or if you're just going to pick whichever one can capture the most value for you in the short term, you could simply do one optimal product. In this case, first I want to understand how the options I'm currently considering would fare. The next thing to do is say, are you considering revenue? And I have incremental revenue data, so I'm going to click this box. You will also do that in your homework assignment. I have the first column containing the respondents' IDs, and the last column I don't have any weighting. So I'm not saying that one of my respondents or some of my respondents are more important than others. If I wanted to say that, hey, my sample's biased, I need to make sure that a certain set of customers are represented fairly, I could give them more weight in the simulation. And I'm going to include the market shares for existing product profiles. Now, the other thing you have to do is decide what's the choice rule. And the choice rule means how do customers out there in the marketplace make their decisions when they buy. The first choice rule says that whatever is their preferred option, they always buy. So this makes sense if it's something that they don't have variety seeking for, like a car. You can only afford to buy one car or one house typically. And so whichever you prefer the most is the one you buy. But the share of preference rule might work for something like pizza, because sometimes you might want a certain type of pizza and then other times you're in the mood for a different type of pizza. And so it basically reflects the share of preference, how, most of the time you'd pick your first choice, but some of the time you would pick your second choice. And very infrequently, but more than never, you might pick a third choice. The alpha rule is what we want to use in this case because it integrates our existing knowledge on how the current marketplace is. And it basically combines the part worth data with the market share data to predict new market shares. And the final option is the logit rule. It's another way of predicting market share based on preferences, but it's non-linear. It's not so much just that either you get first choice or nothing, or it's not so much that it reflects preferences in a linear fashion. This is more the case that overall you do what you like the most, but if you're in the middle, you would change a lot. And so it depends on how strong your preferences are. If you have a really strong preference for vegetarian, you're never going to switch to any of your second choice. But if you're in the middle, if you have mixed preferences, then your choices would alter on occasion. Deciding which choice rule to use depends on the situation. You want to do what's appropriate for the context you're studying. And another thing you can do though is rerun it multiple times with different options selected and see how that changes the projections, because each one has their own set of assumptions. And you want to be sensitive to, did I go with a certain option only because of my choice rule? Or if a certain option always is the best option, no matter what choice rule you use, that might be a stronger indicator that you should go with that option. You can read more about the choice rules in the PDF on conjoint analysis. So once I've selected all my options, I need to run my simulation. Once you've selected all the appropriate data, it'll give you the results of the simulation. And the first thing you want to look at is this table that says market share and revenue simulations. And what it does is it describes how the actual market share compares to the predicted market share. And if you see a big discrepancy between what's actually going on in the marketplace and what's predicted, you might think that, oh no, maybe my study was done incorrectly, or potentially there's something else going on that I didn't capture, like some important attribute or level when I designed my study. Perhaps it could be brand. So maybe the pepper pie is popular in their actual market share more so than what is predicted because they have a very strong brand or they have very good distribution. Now for brand, you could have included that as an attribute. But for distribution, if they're just in all the supermarkets, that's not something you can really evaluate in the conjoint study. So you need to understand if there's big discrepancies here, if there's an explanation that makes sense. In this case, the big discrepancy is simply because I entered in the information randomly. What you can see is how market share will change for each product as you introduce your different options. And in this case, I am able to steal market share. My new products can capture either 24% of the market or 21% of the market. And what I'm doing is I'm stealing it from the pepper pie mainly. And that makes sense because these are both meat options and Aloha Special is pineapple and Heart This is vegetarian. And so would I want to do this or not might depend on who sells pepper pie. Is pepper pie my pizza? Well, in that case, I've stolen market share from myself, but I've replaced a bad product with my own product. Well, that might be for the better of the company, but it might not go over well with the pepper pie brand manager. If it's someone else's brand, if it's a competitor's brand, then things are incredible. I've just stolen market share from one of my competitors. Sounds like a great option. Maybe I'll try to introduce that product. So which one does better? Well, in terms of market share, the Italian sausage does better. In terms of revenue, it does better. And you can also look at this third column, which is most important if you have revenue, and that the weighted revenue by market share indicates that I'll make the most money off of my Italian sausage option. So if these are the only two options I'm considering, I should definitely go with the Italian sausage. And these just describe the different options that I was considering. So based on these results, it seems like the Italian sausage is the preferred option in terms of which pizza I should produce. But these are based on certain options I was considering already ahead of time. And it doesn't take into consideration things like strategic fit with my overall portfolio. If it's cannibalization that's occurring, if I own the pepper pie brand, I might need to consider that because with the Italian sausage, the pepper pie goes down to only 1% of the market. I'd probably have to pull it. I also might need to consider, am I being limited to just the factors that I considered in my study design? Is there some other option out there that I might want to do? Maybe I could combine veggie and sausage and pepperoni together and make a pizza supreme. I wouldn't be able to use the marketing engineering simulation to test that. I also need to be cautious of, did I have the right respondents? Did I survey the right people? There's also some graphs that are produced. This is the predicted market share. And then this is the predicted market share with the Italian sausage introduced and Chicagoland za introduced. Well, let me go back to the part worths for a second. Overall, there wasn't much consistency in terms of preferences. Although pepperoni was preferred by everybody some, other people preferred sausage, and some people liked pineapple or veggie. What I might want to do is consider, is there a particular segment I should serve? Should I do some combination of these options? So while amount of cheese and price are mutually exclusive, if you choose one, you can't choose the other. Other options like toppings could be combined in creative ways. So should I think outside of the pizza box? And going back to the simulation, there's some other things I can do. I can go to, in run analysis, I can choose the optimal product profiles, and I can optimize for revenue. This time, let's say I'll choose a different choice rule. Let's say the logit rule. The results of this analysis tell me how optimal products, ones that have been optimized to reflect the preference part worth, impact the marketplace. I can see how market share is captured among the several different options that exist already. and I can see how much market share is gained. What's interesting to note is optimal product 5 has the highest revenue, but it's weighted by a lower market share. So its revenue weighted by market share happens to be lower than optimal product number 1. So what are these optimal products? If I scroll down, I can see what the characteristics of each optimal product is. And of these, I can select the one that fits the best in terms of the revenue and the market share, but also in terms of my brand, my fit to my target customer, anything else in the background of the case for your homework assignment. I also might want to consider the fixed costs that go into setting up the production of the pizza. So far, I've only focused on the per unit cost, but maybe some of these pizzas require some expensive complex setup. Maybe a thick crust pizza would require me to buy some new machinery, and there'd be a fixed cost associated with that. In comparing the revenue weighted by market share for these optimal profiles, you can see I'm in the 30s. Going back to the other Excel sheet, I see that the Italian sausage was only going to get a score of 24 and the Chicago Landsaw a score of 20. So unless there's some really compelling strategic reason, I probably want to go with those optimal products. It's not exactly a fair comparison because I used a different choice rule. And so if I really was going to compare the optimal to the pre-planned products, the Italian sausage and the Chicago Landsaw, I would need to do the simulation with the optimal products with the same choice rule that I did the simulation for my planned new products. That way I'm comparing apples to apples. In this case, it appears the optimal is better, but that could have been simply because I used a different choice rule. Before I end this presentation, I want to talk about your case. Your case is to do a conjoint for a hotel brand that's going to launch in Happy Valley, the Penn State College market. That's a seasonal market. Hotels have very high fixed costs, but their variable costs are pretty low, and so price fluctuations are very important to that market, particularly if demand is seasonal and with football games and graduation, kind of like Eugene. You need to understand that Conjoint is a very helpful tool and how it can be used and where it adds value, but you also have to understand it's dangerous. And all the simulations are optimizing based on the preferences that reflect what was actually studied. That doesn't mean they asked the right respondents. That doesn't mean that all of the right levels were included. That doesn't mean that from this information you couldn't come up with some better creative option. So don't limit yourself just to focusing on what the software says is optimal. You could come up with some strategic case to do something different that isn't considered by the software. I want you to be able to reflect on, does the study do a good job of capturing what likely matters to that market? I want you to take into consideration other tools. You could potentially do a segmentation to check to see if they've done a good job of focusing in on their target segment, or if they have ratings of customers that are actually pretty different. And if they want to serve a few different segments, how could they customize their offering to do so, taking into consideration the part works? So that doesn't mean you have to do an entire segmentation and then run a simulation for each different segment, but it does mean it's a good idea to check and think about it. I want you to calculate the costs. So you have fixed costs to design different hotels. Will the fixed costs depend on the design option? You also need to think about the variable costs with each different attribute and level within attribute. How will that affect the profits? And I want you to be forward-looking. Be considerate of any assumptions that have gone into the process. Be considerate of any risks. Should you have done a different type of data collection or complement the conjoint with a different analysis? And think about their brand positioning and their value proposition as a company. You may need to read a little bit about Conjoint for some of your answers, particularly the Wikipedia page where there's a nice list of advantages and disadvantages. The bundling and rating method is particularly effective for predicting real-world choices in terms of having customers only rate a few products that are described as the whole product comprised of different attributes. But at the same time, And if you're not using an adaptive conjoint, you're limited to the options that you put into your study design up front, and you only get ratings on what you've actually had included in your study design. Now the nice thing is the software says, okay, if you have 216 possible hotels that you could design, here's the 16 that I need evaluations on to be able to predict how each part is valued. So just be thoughtful. Okay, good luck. Your homework is actually pretty straightforward, especially if you can go ahead and look at this Conjoint tutorial PDF along with this video. The PDF helps walk you through each step and talks a little bit more about what goes into each option. And the key is always about how well you do in taking the results and thinking about them strategically in a big picture way, looking short-term and long-term, considering other things such as your complete brand portfolio, where you're going as a company, the market, the customers, the competitors, how might competitors react. Competitive reaction isn't taken into account in any of the simulations. So when you do the exercises in the case, make sure you think about all these things and try to be very thoughtful in your responses. When you think about designing something like a brand new hotel, you're going to put a ton of money into the architecture, the engineering, the construction, the interior design. You better get it right. And Conjoint can be helpful in helping you do that, rather than just going off your gut. But don't get tunnel vision and be too focused on what the data tells you. You also have to have that creativity, because you know what you got to do. You got to give.
We got to give the people time.